Good morning, everyone. It's a very good-looking crowd. I don't feel like I look as good as you guys, so kind of nervous here. No, we have a wonderful panel today. As Parham mentioned, this is the Critical Infrastructure Resiliency, Cyber Threats and Priorities. To my soon-to-be right will be Ann Dunkin. Ann is the CIO for the Environmental Protection Agency, and then we have Maria Roat, who is the CTO for Department of Transportation. The kind of schematics of how we're going to do this is we are going to have both Ann and Maria do a 10 to 15 minute discussion on their topic of choice.
5 minutes. Yeah.
More like 5 minute. Definitely we want to make sure that you have enough time for questions, right? There's nothing worse, we discussed earlier, than a panel that doesn't allow time for the audience to ask questions. So, and then we will go into an open panel session, and then we'll move over to questions from the floor. So without further ado, Ann, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, as we said, Maria and I were both talking. We're like, yeah, we'll keep this quick, and then you guys get lots of time for questions. Because it is frustrating when you get through a whole panel and there's like, oh, you can ask one question at the end. So, protecting our infrastructure, whether that's our IT infrastructure or natural resources, is as we all know, very difficult. And I learned, I worked in education for 5 years, and I learned there that hacking is easier than ever, right? Systems are harder to defend than ever, and you really can get owned by a 12-year-old with a laptop. It never happened to me, but it happened to a number of my colleagues while I was working in K-12 education. And it's not pretty trying to explain why your entire network got taken down by a 12-year-old. So when you think about IT infrastructure, you have to remember that we're all interconnected, and the weakest link, whatever it may be, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, is what hackers can use to traverse our networks, right? And they can move from my network to Maria's network to your network, right? Once they get in, they can find ways to get to other people's assets. And there are more people out there making threats than ever and acting on those threats, nation states, profiteers, activists, kids, and insiders. So, and there are, because there are more ways in and more places that your data gets out. So we've got, now we're dealing with a variety of data that we didn't expect to be, or systems we didn't expect to be on our network, right? We've got Internet of Things data, sensor data coming to our networks, and you've got to make sure that that data is not opening a backdoor for someone. You've got to make sure that data is clean and free of malicious code. You've got things like free services that your staff are using that they haven't bothered to vet. Things that outside the government, people can just go use their credit card and buy, and the next thing you know, you've got this service running on your network you never knew about. So there are lots and lots of ways for malicious code to get into your system. So we really have to assume that all of our networks are compromised, whether it's, I said, that network that's protecting the physical infrastructure like water and roads, or whether it's the network in your office. And that doesn't mean we stop trying to protect them, but it also means we need to focus on protecting the most valuable assets within the networks, right? Whether those are those physical assets like roads and bridges or logical assets like data. So really it's that assumption that everything's compromised, identify your most important assets and protect those. You have to be able to detect, we have to be able to detect anomalous behavior, both inside and outside our network, what users are accessing, where from, and in what volume. So if you lose something, you want to actually know you lost it. And no one likes having to assume they lost everything because they can't tell what they lost, because that's not a message you want to put out. And we know people who've had to put out the message, I lost everything because I really don't know what was stolen. So, just a few thoughts before I wrap up and we move on to Maria's comments and our discussion. We have to strike a balance between security and usability. While we have to practice the basics of cyber hygiene, one side doesn't fit all. Where we can't just check the box and do the same thing everyone else does. We have to tailor our security programs to the unique risks of the infrastructure we're protecting and the importance of the data or the assets we're protecting. As we know, educating our end users is increasingly difficult. It's not that they don't care, they do. Many are very aware of threats, and we get lots of people sending us things that they think are threats, whether they actually are or not. We prefer that they are on that side. But things are more sophisticated. Try and identify a phishing email now. I've had more than my share that I can't really tell at first glance whether it's real or not. And that happens to our users, and those who are less suspicious will get caught up in those. So there's one more thing I want to mention around protecting our assets, and that's how we build our IT assets. And that's because we sometimes, in the rush to move to modern practices, we sometimes forget that security is one of the benefits of modern practices. The legacy systems we have today were built that did not contemplate a threat from across the country. They didn't even really contemplate a threat from down the hall. They didn't expect to be internet connected, and they certainly didn't expect to be threatened by someone who was 6,000 miles away trying to hack your system. So fundamentally, older systems were not designed with security in mind, and they weren't designed with practices that made them particularly easy to secure. So by modernizing the applications and the infrastructure that they're running on, we can bake security into our systems. We can sometimes protect the things we already have out there, but it's much easier to design in security into new systems. So that is really, I think, one of our other keys to protection is really designing our new systems in ways that we can protect them. So, and I'll also finally add that I want to sort of suggest that the cloud is not a dangerous place to be, but in fact that there are many cloud providers that can protect your assets better than you can. Right? They're specialized in certain areas, and for example, I'm convinced that Microsoft or Google could protect my mail better than I could, because that's what they do all day. So, don't be afraid of the cloud as a resource in order to be more secure. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up and hand off to Maria.
Thank you. So I've been at transportation almost 2 years now this summer, and it's really been interesting being there because having been at DHS for 10 years before that, understanding DHS, understanding critical infrastructure, the work that NPPD does, and some of the others just across all of DHS, and then coming into transportation and learning about just the transportation sector. People don't think about transportation as a system of systems, so I'm stepping away a little bit from the technology piece for a minute, but as a system of systems. You drive down the road, and you don't think about the rail and the connectedness with the buses and the rest of the transit and the whole organization. But think about transportation as a system of systems. And when you start looking at transportation as a system of systems, you really understand how people move, how things happen. And last year, there was a report that the Secretary put out about Beyond Traffic 2045. And it's about 300 pages, so there's, in addition to what Richard talked about, the big thing to read, there's something else at 330 pages for you to read. But it looks at transportation today, it looks at how people move, and it looks out through till 2045 of how transportation and where people are going to live and how transportation is going to change over the next 30 years. When you think about transportation and bridges, you don't build a bridge for 5 years, you don't build it for 2 years, you're building it for 50, 60 something years. Same with roads. So think about transportation a little bit differently as a system of systems and tie that to how people move. And then think about that in a little different context of critical infrastructure, which is what you're here talking about today. So don't look at transportation in and of itself, you have a bridge, but tie that to where the bridge is, how people are moving across that bridge, time of day, is it freight that's going over that bridge? How does that tie into hazmat? How does that tie into things that are moving? So think about transportation as a system of systems and a little bit differently. One of the things that we're working on right now, smart cities, I know there's a breakout session around smart cities later on, but the Department of Transportation came out with a challenge a few months ago for the cities across the U.S. And 78 cities wanted to participate in a Smart Cities Challenge. Now, we were taking bets internally how many cities would apply. Mine was 45, and informally, so these were informal bets. I said 45. It came out 78 cities across the U.S., mid-sized cities, wanted to participate in a Smart City Challenge. So it's a living laboratory over the next 3 years. So the first 2 years is really bringing in the technology to connect all of those transportation sectors, all of those transportation pieces into an interactive network. So starting to bring in the technology into that network. You've got bits and pieces of that already going on. but starting to bring in those bold, those innovative ideas on how to build a smart city. So, and we know that one size doesn't fit all, today, and with the transportation challenges, from one city to the next. But looking at one city as a living laboratory over the next few years. So the smart city, there'll be 40 million from DOT. There's some other companies, Vulcan Technologies, to support infrastructure for electric vehicles. There's a lot going around the buses and things like that. The winner, it's down to 7 cities right now, and the winner will be announced in June of this year out of those 7 cities. So there's a whole team working around this, and the data around that is really important. When you think about driving down a road, everyone drives on the right side of the road. All of your stop signs are red octagons, right? Think about technology. Think about those standards and those kind of things in a different platform when you're talking about technology and getting to those type of standards. And really, when you start thinking about transportation, you think about those smart cities and the connectedness. How do you take all of that information, and how does that tie back to what you're talking about today, the resiliency and the criticality of the transportation sector in the US. So really there's going to be new concepts coming out of that, new ideas, open data, tying that open data to what we know today, not just for transportation, but for other sectors, and how do you start marrying that up? So to tie into what you're doing today, think about those smart cities, think about transportation as a system. I know there's a breakout later around the smart cities and transportation and all, but think about it from that perspective.
Those both were fantastic, and the kind of grand depth of differential between Environmental Protection Agency and where critical infrastructure falls into that category, and then something like transportation. To Maria's point, you don't really realize how critical of of an infrastructure asset it just encompasses from every standpoint possible, right? So going to move on to a couple of questions here, just for get the kind of interactive thought leadership juices flowing. Prior to, as Parham mentioned, I'm VP CTO at FireEye for IoT, industrial control, critical infrastructure, and a partridge in a pear tree. I also was senior vice president at Siemens for that, so I oversaw all of the cyber services globally for plants, and then CTO at Intel, McAfee before that, and then 10 years of Air Force before that. So large, majority of my time has been around protecting critical infrastructure and the differences between your enterprise IT and your OT infrastructure. First question, and I'll completely leave this open, and it can either be per topic, or it can be just off the wall broad. But what are some of the unique threats, vulnerabilities, and challenges to our nation's most critical infrastructure and assets? And it can be either towards EPA and transportation, or it can just be as an industry as a whole.
Okay, so this weekend, I was actually writing some notes at the table this morning. There's a hackathon going on out in California, and there's 6 agencies out there. DOT being one of them, VA's out there. There's 4 other agencies are out there that are participating with industry. So there's a whole hackathon and a number of challenges. And talking about vulnerabilities and those kind of things, this is kind of timely. They sent me a bunch of links this morning for the projects for that hackathon. And one of those was around hazmat. Looking at the instances of hazmat just across the U.S. and by different modes of transportation. So I wrote down a few notes here, and one of those groups is really looking at the damaging. And they're using data to look at cross-referencing the type of substance. What kind of a substance? Is it explosive? Is it flammables? Those kind of things. And what mode of transportation? Was it on a train? Was it on a some type of carrier or something like that? So they're really using that hackathon to really look at the data and look at it differently for incidents. This goes to vulnerabilities and criticalities, and really saying, can you use this data that we know, around freight, around different types of transportation, the quantity, the capacity, how it's moving, where it's moving, and can you take that data and predict future future instances, and what's normal versus what's not, where there's anomalies. So there's a whole group at the Hackathon right now that's doing this. So I wrote a bunch of notes on that. It was actually timely for this panel that through hackathons and through open data that already exist out there between transportation in the states and the different modes of transportation. So that's available, and people are using it to use it as predictors, and that's open data.
Yep.
So actually, that's a great example, and I'll tie into that. So there's a program in EPA called eManifest, which is developing the next generation for managing hazardous waste movement in the country. So when producers have to dispose of hazardous waste, right now what happens is there's this multi-part paper form. People fill out this multi-part paper form. They put the paper form on the truck. Truck has an accident, gets hijacked, whatever. The only copy of that data is on the truck. So if you're looking at this burning truck by the side of the road, your guess is as good as mine, other than the little symbol on the side to figure out what might be on that truck. So we're providing an electronic means to generate that data and to report that data and to have that data available at all times. Now, the interesting challenge is that data is public. It's data that the public has a right to know what hazardous waste is moved, where it's moved, how it's disposed, but it's a risk to have it available immediately. So there's been a lot of discussion about how you handle it, and basically the solution in this particular case is the data will go online 30 days after it's delivered to its final destination. So it's public data, but it's held privately while that waste is being transported to reduce risk of say, foul play with the waste that's in transit.
I think this goes to we didn't talk ahead of time about this,
No,
by the way.
Yeah.
But we're working on a project where we did a dashboard of all the safety data across all the modes of transportation. And I was just sitting here thinking that, we looked at rail and pedestrians and bicycles, and I can tell you where in the country, don't go to Houston as a pedestrian. And we were able to look at, and Chicago's second behind that. But we took the data across the department that was previously siloed, and we pulled it together in this dashboard, and we did it, on a sprint cycle. Every 2 weeks we added on a set of data. And I was sitting here thinking that if you take it, and how we saw trending over days of the week, hours of the day, days of the month, all of that over a year, and then you take the hazmat piece and start overlaying on it, and that's all open data, it could be incredibly interesting to see what comes out of that.
That's a great point. And I typically use the example of the differentiator between IT and OT, where IT you got 0-day worries, and OT you've got 0-decade worries, right? And it's true, right? I mean, commodity malware that affected the enterprise IT, infrastructure 10 years ago, which is easily protected now, is rampant in the OT space. You still see configure in almost every plant out there, and you're talking plants for nuclear power, water, chemical, very detrimental to the economy as we know it. So those are both great points. I'm now going to look at burning trucks on the side of the road, completely different. I'm going to look for that, if there's anything left, I'm going to look. That's exactly right, yeah. I'm not going to rush in to try and get it, but I will look at it differently. Next question, and thank you, by the way, for those. So what do you think, and this is one that you hear at almost every industrial control conference, it's always weighs heavily on my mind. What do you think needs to happen in order to help facilitate collaboration, better collaboration between both public and private sectors around the end goal of protecting critical infrastructure? How do we get the public and private sectors to work together, to really kind of, work towards that common goal of being proactive versus reactive?
So I think that there's some interesting challenges in terms of the public and private sector working together.
Sure.
There are some great things out there, right? There's things from a cyber standpoint like InfraGard that brings together public and private sector. But there are some real perceived issues at this point. I think with the private sector cooperating with the public sector, concerns about whether the information they share will be kept confidential, and then our habit in the public sector of making everything classified, right? We can't cooperate, we can't share if the most basic information is classified. So there's some real efforts underway to try and improve collaboration by declassifying a lot of the threat information that really shouldn't be classified. We're not talking about things that really should be, but things that we've habitually classified, to try and declassify those to make sure that there can be a more open dialogue between the public and private sector. It has to be something that's obviously mutually beneficial, that both sides feel like they're getting value out of that collaboration.
Yeah, so a couple of things on that point. Starting internally, one of the things that we're trying to look at is, well, we maintain a bridge inventory, and there's information on bridges. It's about the bridge, and that's it, not who's going over the bridge. And from an purely engineering perspective. So think about that bridge information, and the sensors that are starting to be deployed on it. And how you can use that. So getting the engineers to think a little bit differently about, a bridge and engineering data, and really look at about people data and people movement data. But, that partnership, take that to the next level. So you've got internally, get people to think a little bit differently, but the partnerships, we work with states, we work with industry, with DHS, any kind of disaster, FEMA, for instance. I know Adrian's going to be here later on one of the panels. FEMA, from a transportation perspective, we're working closely with DHS and entities like FEMA because we've got the inventories, whether it's bridges, roads, and bridges, and those types of inventory, and it's incredibly important. And our partnerships with industry as well, when you start talking about V2V, V2I, the connected cities, the smart cities, industry is a huge partner on all of this. And something else that we're working on, which is huge among all of our stakeholders, across the federal government, is a national address database. So we'll put in a little plug for that we don't have one, and we're building that out because an address is not just your house, it's not just a business, it's X, Y, and potentially Z coordinates. And that's incredibly important in time, whether it's a natural disaster or something to do with critical infrastructure or something like that. So I think the partnerships that we have with industry, with our federal partners, our state and locals, is just incredibly important. I know we reached out to Ann, a couple of months ago to get some data from over there to tie into some of the work we're doing. So I can't stress enough that, the open data, the partnerships is really driving a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah, and so I think that I'll just let Maria talk all the time first because it's a good point. So you're working in a national address database. We're working on our facility registry, right? So all the facilities, all the manufacturing facilities, everything in the country, we're trying to have on the facility registry. And we have all the facilities at this point that the EPA regulates, but they're not all in the same registry. And so we're trying to pull them together so that everyone uses the same registry to improve that data, to make it available for a variety of uses, including emergency responders when they need to be able to understand where a facility is geographically located, to have that information, have it be correct. And we actually now have other agencies reaching out to use that database, which is great because the more people that use those databases, the better they get. And the better the quality of the data is, and the more useful they are to everybody.
Absolutely. This one's kind of a fun one, and then obviously in the interest of time, we'll open questions up to the floor. But what is your vision and/or prediction for the future of critical infrastructure? And I know this is a very open-ended question, right? And I have my opinions. I'm sure you do as well. But keep it somewhat close, right? Next 5 to 10 years. As we look back the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say we've grown substantially, but I don't think we're where we should be. As far as being at Siemens, we'd go out and we'd see these plants firsthand. You're talking nuclear power, water, scary stuff, and an old legacy 15-year-old firewall separating the traversing capabilities between IT and OT scares me, and especially getting down to the Purdue stack where you've got your SCADA servers, your HMIs, your PLCs, things that are extremely critical in that environment. So, and this could be an IT question or an OT question, but as far as critical infrastructure, 5 to 10 years, ballpark. I mean, are we going to be, mediocre, or are we going to really step things up? I know Ann's itching for that one.
Is that a hint? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's completely, yes.
So, I think, as I mentioned when I first started talking, one of the challenges with whether it's physical infrastructure or networks or the specific set of data is that we are at risk for people traversing our networks to those, right? So you have to assume that whatever network you use to access either a physical asset or a logical asset is compromised. Right? You have to start from the assumption that while you're going to try and protect your network, someone's gotten into it and you don't know it. And then you have to look at your assets, again, whether that's a reservoir or a bridge or whatever it is, and protect those assets on a logical and physical scale individually. What are my most important assets and how do I protect them? And I think that that's the trend over the next 5 to 10 years as people are beginning to recognize that they have to identify their most important assets and that they have to find ways to protect those assets individually, even while they try and protect the larger system as a whole. Because you can't have this attempt to have a hard shell on the outside and this soft gooey inside, right? That's not going to continue to be successful because we've proven that if someone is determined enough, they will find a way inside that hard outer shell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really geared that towards Ann because we were speaking outside prior, and the concept of air gapped. You go to these companies and they're like, my OT infrastructure is air gapped. I've never seen in history of 18 years plus of industrial control security a true air-gapped technology, right? I mean, to Ann's point, there's a hard shell with a GUI center. So I think that was the absolute question. Did you have anything, Maria, or I can open up to the floor for questions?
Yeah, tying into what Ann said, the pipelines, perfect example of, while we're all about open data, sharing data, open data, making it available, there's things like pipelines that, we need to protect those systems and those types of information. And there needs to be a balance between what's open, what's shared, versus what we actually have to keep in-house for something much like a pipeline inventory.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And we have to protect that.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very valid point. So I guess we can take time to open up. We've got a good amount of time for questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, David Winks with ICIT. This is a question to both panelists. As we become more reliant on sensor data, what recommendations do you have for industry to prevent the modification of that data that's intended to mislead human decision-making?
That's a really good question.
Okay. So I think that, we're all dealing with that question right now. We are, Maria talked about her Smart Cities Challenge. We're doing our own Smart Cities Challenge, although the numbers are much, much smaller in terms of the money we're putting out there. And, it's about citizens collecting data with sensors or, in other cases, organizations collecting data with sensors. But the problem is huge, right? How do you determine whether you have good sensor data and how do you protect that? So you have to have some sort of capability before data comes into your system when you collect it from a sensor to validate, number one, it's not malicious, right? No one is piggybacking malicious code on that sensor data coming into you. Number two, that it's accurate, that it's within bounds, right? You have to look and make sure it's not an outlier data. The example I often use is if I've got a sensor in a lake and someone comes and idles their boat next to it, and all of a sudden I start getting readings, that the temperature is elevated by 20 or 30 degrees Celsius, I don't want to keep those readings, right? I want to drop those readings out because they're anomalous, right? So you've got to be able to have those capabilities to make sure that they're not malicious and that the data is within bounds and reasonable so that you can make good decisions with that data. And then it's equally important once the data is on your system to protect it, to make sure that no one then can tamper with it. So we talk about data that's open, right? We want to share that data, but it's important that while we share that data, we also make sure that no one's able to tamper with it. So there's those three things basically you need to be able to do.
That's a great response. Yes, ma'am.
I'll just talk loud, I guess. You guys talked a lot about aggregating more data into databases and that kind of thing. What are the cybersecurity concerns that come with making more databases and putting more data together in those ways?
So I guess it comes back to so from the transportation perspective, we don't collect all that data, right? Is it the city's going to maintain the data? They're going to keep it. They're going to make it available when you look at some of the city initiatives and things. While we get safety data and those kind of things from transportation, we are not the collector of information. We are not the owner of those databases. In those instances where we're getting, like, for example, the safety data, where we make it available, you know, accidents and those kind of things, you know, some of that's made available, but we are not the source of it. The cities are the source of that in many instances. So to your question about, you know, collecting all of that, the federal government really isn't in the business of collecting. We'll use that data. Do we have to make sure it's from authoritative source, that nobody's hijacked it along the way, and understanding that and being a partner with the states as they're securing that. But making it available, there's no reason to duplicate sometimes that data if we can reach out as we need to pull it.
And also to
query
that
it.
point, right, it's kind of like the concept of big data. You have all this data, you know, how much of it is actually relevant and how much of it is counterproductive?
Yeah, do
you
we
know?
need all of it?
Yeah, do I spin cycles on stuff that's not actually going to, you know, help facilitate my choices, or do I, really focus on the more critical? And to your point, do I need all of it?
And then, you know, for some of that data, when you look at the cities and information, you know, if you're driving your car or riding down the road, you want to know that there's ice on the bridge ahead of you. How much information do you give up to get the information that there's ice? You know,
That's a great point.
I'm at some kind of XY coordinate. At this point in time, I may not have to give up personal information, but, you know, we share our location all the time on our phones.
Yeah, I'm actually working with the CEOs of the 5 major automotive industries and trying to, you know, focus on connected cars. And that's a whole nother concept, right? I mean, I think it is relevant to connected cities, but right, how much data am I giving up in order to get that data back, right? And is that data secure? And I think we talked about, you know, one of my colleagues, you know, by 2020, there's going to be over 50 billion connected devices. There's a connected device per person at the moment this year, which, you know, equates to, you know, 6 billion, but within, you know, next 4 years, give or take, there's going to be over 50 billion connected devices. It's a lot of data traversing. That's a lot of unknown hands touched. Yeah, so it's
Some of it goes to the manufacturers, some of it
You're
goes
absolutely
different
correct.
directions.
That's
so.
right. That's right. And how does the manufacturer safeguard that data as well, right? Ann, did you have anything on that?
So I think I would just add that, you know, we collect a lot of regulatory data, right? And it's of different levels of sensitivity, right? Some of our regulatory data is confidential business information. Some of it is public information, but the states want to analyze it, evaluate it, maybe take enforcement action before we get it or before we make it public. Some of it comes directly to us and becomes public immediately. So we've got a lot of data. We have to actually be able to bring it together to analyze that data and make it useful, but we also have to maintain the distinctions as to how public or private that data is. At the same time, we're bringing it together inside our firewall.
That's a great point. It's essentially kind of a consistent cycle. Next question? Yes, sir. Or I'm sorry, sir.
Thank you. I think my question may have changed now. Thanks for the insight. Dwayne Hodges, you had mentioned about asset protection, and you know, I think we've been on the hook for the Internet of Things for a while. In fact, the Coke machine was introduced in 1982, and we'll send a temperature report back, and that's how Carnegie Mellon said we'll come up with this idea to switch out Cokes based off that thought process. And I guess what I'm getting at is that if we focus too much on just asset protection and we leave out the people part, with collecting so much information and so much data, you know, I think that General Alexander and General Hayden, they floated this a few years ago about gated communities, and we did this for 20 years in the military. We looked at the people and we constantly authenticated those people coming in, and we rejected those that weren't right, and we put clearances on those people. Is there a thought against that as we connect smart cities, as we build more things everywhere and anywhere, and we say, hey, we're going to bring more things into the Internet of Everything? Yes, make sure the right people come in at the right time and kick them out against the processes and against the assets. I mean, I think the asset protection is real good, but I think that people will always be our problem. I mean, I think that most security people can fix a firewall, but we can't fix the people that break the firewall. So what are your thoughts on that, and are we going to head towards the gated community with 3 billion people connected right now?
Great question.
It's a really interesting question.
I hope I didn't
because-
start a fight.
No. We'll find out. It's a really interesting question because there are levels of authentication for different things, right? So we look at this, again, with our regulatory data. We say, if you're just coming in to look at data, I don't care who you are. I don't need to know who you are. I can let you onto my portal as a public user. You can create an account or not, and I'm not going to authenticate to make sure you're who you say you are, because all you're doing is looking at my data. But there are varying levels of access. If I'm a state employee and I want to get to that data, well, now I need to prove that you're from that state, and I need some level of authentication. Maybe I say you need to have a state email address from the right state. And then we go up to the point of saying you need a PIV authentication because this is extremely secure data, and I want to know exactly who you are. So there's just levels of data security, and you need to match the data to the level of security. As you were talking about, Maria, right? You don't want to say, hey, if I want to know the bridge is icy, I need a PIV card authentication to tell you if the bridge is icy, right? I want to be able to match the security of the data to the authentication I require from you to either see or change that data.
I know on some of the things like V2V, NHTSA is National Highway, NHTSA. Yes, thank you. Brain's not engaged yet.
Early.
I know they're looking at a lot, and this goes a little bit beyond, even, accessing authenticating data, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, all of those kind of things, and how do you authenticate back and forth? There's a big security component to that, and I know they've posted a lot of information up there.
It's a fantastic point.
That's a cool problem.
Sir, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering about, I was wondering about aggregation of data. We are collecting data from different sources, so on. Does that create a potential vulnerability? How do you manage that? Different pieces of data is available. That different pieces, some of the breaches happened in certain agencies in the past. Basically, the data was leveraged, different pieces were leveraged from different places but available. And how do you how do you mitigate that kind of thing? How do you manage that kind of a situation?
So essentially, the aggregation of all this data and the correlation, and I'm trying to validate. So, as they're collecting this data, how do they manage and identify,
The potential vulnerability.
associated with that data?
Yes.
I think it goes back to what Ann said, the hard shell on the outside, you can't have that squishy on the inside, and you have to be able to protect that, and how do you do it? And making sure your systems are have the right security posture to protect that data, and while a lot in transportation that we have is open and public, there is some that is sensitive data when you look at pipelines, and it's up to us to make sure that those systems are protected and making sure the controls are in place, and that, if somebody does get in, is there lateral movement across the department from one system to another? So when you're looking at it, if they get into a system maybe at railroads, can they laterally move across the department into a pipeline system perhaps? Because the controls aren't in place to be able to do exactly what you said, pulling in the aggregation of some of that.
Let me restate, if I may. Say you have information about bridges, and you protect that and keep that information however that's accessible. Somebody else may have information about chemicals or something like that. So that may have information about destinations going in certain direction. So aggregating from two different sources, each one is protected, however, is available, getting correlated, just like different strategies about breaking into systems, can be leveraged potential vulnerabilities. So how do we manage that kind of thing?
So, I think if I hear what you're saying, what if I have the bridge data over here and someone gathers that data and then they grab the road data and they put it together with the bridge data and they learn more than I want
That's
them to
already
learn?
online.
Yeah, exactly. The data's already there. And I think that it's a bigger challenge for transportation, right? If someone aggregates all the data across, facilities that produce chemicals, it's probably not as interesting as it is, getting the roads and bridges. But yeah, the genie's out of the bottle with a lot of public data. After 9/11, there's some data, and I don't know if it happened with pipelines, it certainly happened with water. Some of the water data that was public got pulled back, right, because we were worried about it. I don't know if the pipeline data was public before 9/11, but the genie was already out of the bottle, right? People had that data, and then we pulled it back in.
Right.
So, people will be able to take data, aggregate it, correlate it, and once that data is public, you can't stop people from doing that analysis.
I mean, I know there's a lot of security protection around. When you have that bridge, you have road data, right? Now all of a sudden you know what freight movement is, and you know what the hazmat looks like, and so that I think goes right to your point about being able to pull those different data sources, bridge inventory or road network, which is open, and then you've got hazmat, potentially whether it's freight or motor carriers or whatever it might be. So you've got this hazardous material that's in transit. You can start overlaying, and then if you have information off a bridge and you know that from this bridge information, this road information, you understand how people move, and you understand that this time of day and this time of day are when the most people are over that bridge. And oh, by the way, when there's a hazmat movement, something may be going over that bridge, under that bridge, or on that road. Somebody could maybe potentially tie that together.
But I'd also add that, you could have done that by watching the bridge.
Yep.
20 years ago, right? So
you can do it today.
Yeah, you can sit there and watch the bridge. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe you made it easier for someone to tie all that data together, or maybe you made it hard. Maybe it's harder because they have to do the analytics. I don't know.
I mean, I see all that go through Pointer Rocks every day while I'm waiting on the train.
It's going to be actually a new part of the Waze app. Is going to be like a notify a hazmat spill. Right? It's just, the potential is endless, right? I know, absolutely. Yes, you had a question in the corner?
Yes. We've had a lot of talk about data and a little bit of talk about the Internet of Things. We're constantly reminded when we update Java and we see a Java update that 3 billion devices run Java. And I know there's an awful lot of different testing protocols in various government entities, state, local, federal, and they all seem to mirror the same set of testings. I mean, NIST has the NIAP certification and ISO 15048 and EAL levels. And my question is this, is there a push or is there a priority on those logical access devices like, say for instance, access points, MFDs, multifunctional devices on networks? And by the way, I'm James Hanover with Konica Minolta, so that's something very near and dear to me. My company makes a point in testing and in architecture not to use any Java-based systems because they're so easily hackable. And so my question is what sort of priority is given to that kind of Internet of Things attack? Because there's a lot of things out there that are running Java that are open and they're on the network. So
I think I was on a project, I guess, 3 years ago about the convergence of IT and OT. And when you start looking at the sensors and those kind of things, which is a little bit about what you're talking about, go back to the manufacturers, right? How are the sensors being built? Are they keeping them up to date? What are they building them with, right?
Well, and
all
I
the
think
way down to the source.
Yeah.
All the way down to the fundamental level of building that sensor when you start looking at the stack, all the way lower down in the stack, right? At the lowest level, how is that being built and what's being built on top of it? Java's higher up in the stack, right? When you start looking fundamentally lower in the stack, how is industry, how the manufacturers keeping that code base up to date that'll allow you, whether using Java or not, to do your updates on top of it? You can have a refrigerator, like Richard said this morning, that tells you about your milk, but great, if nobody's updating that sensor itself, over time it'll become a vulnerability. And that's fundamentally lower in the stack than where you are with dealing with the Java up here too. So I'm going to push that back down to some of the industry and manufacturing as well to keep that code base up to date.
Right, and I'll add. I mean, you're worried about Java, right? I'm worried about someone's HVAC system on my network. I mean, think about how the Target breach happened, right? Yep. I mean, there were other issues, but they eventually started at the HVAC system. So it comes back to I can't assure that every one of those systems is going to be secure, right? So I need to make sure I'm going to start by isolating those systems on their network, but then I also have to there's a risk that someone's going to traverse from that network to another part of my network. So again, I got to secure the assets I care about because no matter what I do to try and isolate those things that are likely to be risky, there's always the potential that someone's going to get from there to somewhere else on my network.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, because Target especially was the first time we had seen someone actually do the complete paradigm shift of coming in through the OT side to penetrate the IT side. So I think it really boils down to security vendors working closely with manufacturers to embed security down to those levels, to your point, Maria, so that I can have Java up at the top stack, but if I'm secured and embedded down below, then that's obviously a nice case point. Yes, ma'am.
So this kind of goes right along with that question, which is in our industrial control systems are really underlying all of our critical infrastructure. And so what are we doing in the public-private partnership? Our ICSs are very proprietary, and we don't receive alerts like we would on a Microsoft Super Tuesday or a Java because they are so proprietary. So what are we doing to develop standards? How do we evaluate their hygiene? We can only isolate so much. They are connected now. So what are we doing in a public-private partnership to work on standards for our ICS, alerting mechanisms to patch our ICS? You just don't see that like you would for our information systems. So how do we move our thought processes that we have on cyber hygiene and patching and awareness on the IT side over to our ICS side?
So I don't think either one of us can tell you what's happening, right, in that space. I will say that you hit the nail on the head, which is you've got to shift that mindset we have on the IT side and bring it over to the OT side. And I think it's a mixed bag as to who's there and who's not. But I think it's other people who can tell you what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, where's Donna Dodson?
We're up here going, we don't have an answer
She's
to that one.
pioneering that kind of convergence between IT and OT, especially in the NIST sector. So great, that's fantastic questions from the audience, fantastic presentations from the panel. Really thank everyone. I think we have a networking break, but Parham is going to come up and take it from here. Thanks, everyone.